Were your parents intense about grades? When I brought home a 98% on my spelling test, my mother made me sit at the kitchen table and write, "I am a failure," 10,000 times, because anything less than 100 meant I was throwing my life away. My parents believed that perfect grades were the only thing separating us from homelessness and death. They demanded absolute perfection on every assignment, quiz, and test. 99% was a failure. A missed bonus question was a catastrophe. Mom kept a giant chart on the living room wall tracking every grade we'd ever gotten. Perfect scores got gold stars. Anything else got red X's that she'd circle while explaining how we'd disappointed our ancestors. My brother Leo had gotten a B+ once in second grade, and she still brought it up 6 years later as the day he chose mediocrity. He'd cried for a week straight when it happened, but that didn't erase the shameful red mark. The punishments were even worse, designed to make us remember our failures forever. When I got a 95% on a math test, Dad made me stand in the front yard holding a sign that said, "I wasted 5% of my potential," while neighbors walked by. 4 hours in the July heat, not allowed to put the sign down even to wipe sweat from my eyes. My neighbor asked if I needed help, and I had to smile and say no. This was just how we learned. My sister Kaya developed a nervous tic from the pressure. Her eye would twitch whenever she took tests, which made it harder to read questions, which made her more likely to mess up. When she got her first A- in 5th grade, Mom shaved her head in the bathroom while explaining that hair was a privilege for successful children. Kaya wore hats for months, but Mom would rip them off at school events so everyone could see what happened to kids who got A-minuses. The worst part was how they'd sabotage us to test our dedication. Dad would hide my textbooks the night before exams to see if I'd studied enough to remember everything. Mom would set our alarms wrong so we'd oversleep and have to rush because true A students can perform under any conditions. Once they changed all our assignment due dates in our planners, then punished us for turning things in late. They said life would trick us too, so we needed to be prepared. When Leo was 12, he made a calculation error on one problem and got a 96% on his science test. Dad drove him to the homeless shelter downtown and made him spend the night there. "This is your future with grades like that," he said, leaving his 12-year-old son with strangers for 8 hours. Leo came back the next morning shaking and wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. He never got below 100% again, but he also stopped sleeping and started pulling his hair out in chunks. I tried to be perfect. I really did. I studied until my eyes blurred, checked my work 20 times, memorized entire textbooks. But everyone makes mistakes. When I got a 94% on an English essay because I'd misunderstood one question, Mom locked me in the basement with a pile of successful people's biographies. "Read about what you'll never become," she said. I spent 3 days down there with no food, just water and books about people who'd apparently never gotten a 94% on anything. Kaya cracked first. She was in 8th grade, taking advanced courses, and the pressure finally broke her. She got a 91% on a history presentation and knew what was coming. Instead of going home, she swallowed a bottle of pills in the school bathroom. They pumped her stomach at the hospital while Mom screamed about how Kaya was ruining her perfect attendance record. Not about almost dying, about missing school. After that, you'd think they'd ease up. Instead, they got worse. They said Kaya's stunt proved we were weak and needed more motivation. They started making us compete against each other. Whoever got the lowest grade each week had to be the other's servant until they redeemed themselves. I spent a month washing Leo's socks because I'd gotten one question wrong on a pop quiz he'd gotten perfect. The breaking point came junior year. I'd maintained straight A+ for 2 years, terrified of anything less. But I was also taking 7 AP classes, doing 3 sports they required for college applications, and sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. When I got my calculus test back with a 93%, I felt something inside me break. Not crack like Kaya, just quietly break. I knew what was coming. Dad would probably make me burn all my belongings since I clearly didn't deserve them. Mom would find some new creative torture to ensure I never wasted 7% of my potential again. They'd probably make me watch while they praised Leo and Kaya for their perfect scores, explaining how I was the family disappointment now. But when I got home, they were weirdly calm. Mom took the test from my hand and studied it carefully. Dad stood behind her, both of them silent. Then Mom looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. "We've been preparing for this day," she said quietly. "The day one of you proved you weren't really our child." Dad pulled out a folder full of documents. DNA tests, apparently, that they'd had done years ago. "We always suspected you weren't ours," he said. I stood there with the test paper shaking in my hands. My fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Dad pulled out this thick folder and opened it on the kitchen table between us. The pages inside had official-looking headers with some lab name I'd never heard of. Numbers covered the documents in columns and percentages. My eyes couldn't focus on any of it because my whole body felt like it was vibrating. Mom started talking in this calm voice about how they'd suspected for years. She said real children from their family wouldn't waste potential like I just did. The 93% proved I didn't have their excellence genes. She kept using that phrase, excellence genes, like it was a real scientific thing. Dad pointed at specific lines on the documents, but the words blurred together. I tried to read the lab name at the top. Something looked off about the font. The letters seemed slightly different sizes, like maybe someone had typed it instead of it being printed professionally. But I couldn't say anything because my throat felt closed up. What punishment was coming next? Would they make me sleep outside? Lock me somewhere worse than the basement? Mom said I could stay in the house for now. That "for now" hung in the air like a threat. Dad added that I'd lost all privileges until I proved my worth. I had to get perfect scores for an entire semester. Not just one test. A whole semester of 100% on everything. One mistake and I'd be out. They didn't say where out meant, but I understood the threat. I took the folder from Dad's hands and looked more carefully at the documents. The lab name definitely looked wrong. The font didn't quite match between the header and the body text. But terror kept my mouth shut. I handed the folder back and walked to my room without saying anything. They let me go. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. My brain kept replaying Leo's face when he came back from the homeless shelter. He'd been 12 years old. Just a kid. Dad had left him there overnight with strangers because of one calculation error. One single mistake on one problem. Leo came home shaking and wouldn't talk for days. He still pulled his hair out in chunks when he got stressed. I thought about Kaya, too. How she looked after Mom shaved her head in the bathroom. Kaya had worn hats everywhere, but Mom ripped them off at the school events. Everyone saw what happened to kids who got A-minuses in our house. My whole life I'd believed everything they told me. The grade chart was normal. The punishments were necessary. Perfect scores were the only thing keeping us from dying on the streets. But something about those DNA documents felt wrong. The font mismatch kept bothering me. Why would a real lab have inconsistent fonts? Why would they test us years ago but only tell me now? The timing seemed too convenient, right after my first major grade drop. But I was too scared to question them directly. What if I was wrong? What if they really did have proof I wasn't theirs? The next morning at the school, I couldn't focus on anything. My calculus teacher handed back homework and I stared at the problems without seeing them. Was I actually adopted? Or was this another test to motivate me back to perfection? They'd done things like this before. Sabotaged us to see if we'd overcome it. Maybe this was just a more extreme version. My calculus teacher noticed me staring into space. She walked over to my desk and asked quietly if everything was okay at home. The question made my stomach hurt. I automatically said yes because that's what we'd been trained to say. Always yes. Everything's fine. Just normal parent stuff. She looked at me for a long moment like she didn't believe me, but then moved on to help another student. I spent the rest of class wondering if I should have said something different. During lunch, I told my friends I needed to use the bathroom and headed to the library instead. The bathroom there was usually empty. I locked myself in a stall and pulled out my phone. This morning, I'd hidden the DNA folder in my backpack when my parents weren't looking. Now I took it out and started photographing every page. My hands shook so bad some photos came out blurry. I had to retake them. The lab letterhead, the percentage columns, the signature at the bottom, everything. Then I created a new email account right there on my phone, used a password my parents would never guess, uploaded all the photos to the account. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes but felt like hours. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. What if someone came in? What if my parents somehow knew what I was doing? After everything uploaded, I deleted the photos from my phone, cleared my browser history, checked 3 times to make sure nothing remained. Then I put the folder back in my backpack and went to my next class. Free period came after lunch. I went to the library computer lab and logged into my secret email account. Started researching DNA tests online. Turned out there were different types. Paternity tests, maternity tests, sibling tests, full genetic profiles. I couldn't tell which kind my parents supposedly had done. The documents didn't specify clearly. Then I started looking up the lab name from the letterhead. Typed it into search engines, checked genetic testing company directories. Nothing came up. The website address printed on the documents didn't match any real genetic testing companies I could find. My stomach started hurting with this weird mix of feelings. Hope that maybe the documents were fake. Fear about what it meant if they were. Why would my parents fabricate DNA tests? What kind of people did that to their own kid? After school, I walked home as slowly as possible. Each step felt heavier. What was waiting for me there? I opened the front door and saw Mom in the living room. She stood next to the grade chart on the wall. All my gold stars were gone. Every single one I'd earned over years of perfect scores. In their place under my name sat a giant question mark drawn in red marker. Mom turned to look at me. She said the question mark stays until I prove I'm worthy of being part of this family. Her voice was calm and cold. She added that I should be grateful they're giving me a chance at all. Most families would just throw out a kid who wasn't really theirs. I nodded and went straight to my room. Didn't argue. Didn't cry. Just nodded like a good daughter who understood her place. That evening, Kaya found me in the hallway outside my room. She looked around to make sure our parents weren't nearby, then whispered that she didn't believe I wasn't their sister. We had the same weird double-jointed thumbs. Both of us could bend our thumbs backward at this strange angle. And we had the same cowlick pattern in our hair. Same exact spot where the hair grew in a different direction. Kaya's eye twitched rapidly while she talked. The nervous tic she'd developed from all the pressure. I realized she was just as scared as me. Maybe more scared. If I wasn't really their daughter, then what did that mean for her and Leo? Were they next? Would our parents decide they weren't real family either if they messed up bad enough? I told Kaya to go back to her room before they caught us talking. She nodded and hurried away. Later that evening, Leo caught me alone near the stairs. He glanced around nervously, then told me in this quiet, shaking voice that he thought the DNA test might be fake. His whole body trembled while he talked. He said he once saw Dad practicing Mom's signature on random documents, just sitting at the desk writing her name over and over until it looked right. Leo had been maybe 10 years old when he saw it. Didn't understand what it meant at the time. But now he wondered if Dad had been practicing to forge her signature on official papers, like maybe DNA test results. Leo kept glancing toward the stairs while he talked, terrified someone would come up and catch us. I asked him when he saw Dad doing that. He said it was a few years ago, around the time they started getting more intense about grades, before Kaya's suicide attempt, before everything got really bad. I told Leo to be careful and not let them know he suspected anything. He nodded and practically ran back to his room. I stood in the hallway alone thinking about everything. The font mismatch, the fake lab name, Dad practicing signatures. None of this was real. They'd made it all up just to punish me for a 93%. I spent that whole night lying in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Dad practicing Mom's signature and the weird font on those DNA documents and how they'd made up this entire lie just to break me down even more. The next morning, I walked into school feeling like my body was moving on autopilot while my brain screamed that I needed to tell someone before things got worse. I went to calculus class and sat through the lesson without hearing a single word, just watching the clock until the bell rang. After everyone else left, I walked up to my teacher's desk and asked if I could speak with the guidance counselor about college stress. Those were the code words we'd learned in health class, the ones that meant you needed help but couldn't say it directly. My teacher looked at me for a second, then nodded and wrote me a pass without asking questions. I walked down the hallway to the counseling office with the pass clutched in my shaking hand, wondering if I was about to make everything worse or finally make it better. The guidance counselor's name was Melissa Moreau, and she had this calm, professional way of moving that made me feel slightly less terrified as she closed her office door behind us. She sat down across from me and asked what was really going on, and something about her voice just made everything crack open inside me. I started crying for the first time since my parents showed me those fake DNA documents, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her everything while tears ran down my face and my voice kept breaking. I told her about the grade chart on our living room wall with all the gold stars and red X's. I told her about the punishments, about standing in the yard with that sign, about Kaya getting her head shaved after an A-, about Mom locking me in the basement for 3 days with no food. I told her about Kaya swallowing those pills in the school bathroom after getting a 91%, and how Mom screamed about her perfect attendance record while they pumped her stomach. I told her about Dad driving Leo to the homeless shelter when he was 12 and leaving him there overnight with strangers. I told her about the DNA documents my parents showed me after my 93% on the calculus test, how they said I wasn't really their daughter, and that's why I couldn't get perfect grades. Melissa listened to everything without interrupting once, just taking careful notes while I talked and cried and shook in the chair across from her. When I finally stopped talking, she put down her pen and explained that she was a mandated reporter, and what I just described was child abuse that she was legally required to report to CPS. I felt this surge of panic shoot through my chest because I was terrified of my parents finding out I'd told someone. Melissa must have seen the fear on my face because she quickly added that CPS would investigate carefully and that I'd done the right thing by telling someone. She asked if I had copies of any evidence, and I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and logged into my secret email account. I showed her the photos of the DNA documents I'd taken, and I watched her expression shift as she studied them on my phone screen. She said something looked off about the formatting, but she wasn't an expert and would need to consult with someone who understood genetic testing. I left her office feeling this weird mix of relief and terror, like I'd finally done something to help myself, but also like I'd just set off a bomb that was going to explode in my face. 2 days later, Melissa called me back to her office during my free period and told me that CPS had called our house to schedule a home visit. My mother had answered the phone and apparently gave such a convincing performance about our wonderful family that the screening seemed to stall. I felt my hope crumbling as Melissa explained this because of course Mom would be perfect on the phone. She'd had years of practice presenting our family as ideal to outsiders, making everything sound normal and healthy when it was anything but. Melissa suggested I start documenting everything in detail, so I bought a small notebook and kept it hidden in my locker at the school. I started writing down every punishment, every threat, every single time my parents referenced the DNA test as proof I was defective, or not really their child. I recorded dates and times and exactly what was said, building a timeline that Melissa said would create a stronger case than just general memories. At home, my parents implemented new rules where I had to earn basic privileges by getting 100% on every single assignment. They checked my homework with a level of scrutiny that made my previous pressure seem mild in comparison. Dad would stand right over me while I worked, leaning down to mark every tiny error with his red pen and explaining how each mistake proved I wasn't really their child. He'd circle a misplaced comma and say that real family members would know better, He'd point at a calculation that was off by 1 decimal point and shake his head like I'd just confirmed their worst suspicions about me. During dinner one night, Kaya slipped me a folded note under the table when our parents weren't looking. I opened it in my lap and read that she wanted to help but didn't know how. I wrote back on the same paper telling her to just stay safe and keep her grades perfect so they wouldn't target her next. I handed it back to her and watched her eye twitch worse than ever as she read my response. I felt guilty for not protecting her better when Mom shaved her head, for not doing something sooner before Kaya got hurt so badly. Leo had started pulling out his hair again in visible patches on the side of his head, and when Mom noticed at dinner, she screamed at him for making the family look bad. She threatened to shave his head too if he didn't stop destroying his appearance. Leo sat at the dinner table with his hands clenched tight in his lap, and I could see him fighting the urge to reach up and pull. He was barely holding on, and I didn't know how to help him without making things worse for both of us. During my next meeting with Melissa, I used my phone to photograph the living room grade chart with all its red X's circled in marker and the giant question mark drawn under my name where my gold stars used to be. Melissa helped me add these photos to my documentation, and we went through the timeline of punishments together, making sure every detail was recorded accurately. While we were looking at the DNA document photos again, Melissa pulled up the lab's actual website on her computer, and we compared the letterhead. The font didn't match at all, and the logo was slightly different too, which suggested the documents might be completely fabricated just like Leo had suspected when he saw Dad practicing Mom's signature years ago. Melissa told me during our next meeting that she knew someone who could look at the DNA documents and tell us if they were real. A genetic counselor named Jing Cottle who worked at the hospital and sometimes helped with cases like mine. Melissa called her right there in the office and explained the situation while I sat on the couch feeling my stomach twist into knots. Jing agreed to review the documents for free after hearing what my parents had done. I pulled out my phone and logged into my secret email account with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I forwarded all the photos to the email address Melissa gave me. Each time I hit send, I was sure somehow my parents would know, would get an alert on their phones that I was building evidence against them. Melissa watched me delete the sent messages and clear my history. She said I was being smart and careful. At home that week, I made myself act like the terrified, obedient daughter they expected. It wasn't hard to seem scared because I was scared every second. But underneath the fear, I felt something new burning in my chest. Anger. Real anger that I'd never let myself feel before because anger meant I thought I deserved better treatment, and I'd been trained to believe I deserved whatever punishment they gave me. I studied for my chemistry quiz until my eyes hurt. I checked every answer 5 times. When I got the test back with 100% written in red at the top, I brought it home and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything. Mom picked it up and studied it for a long time like she was looking for mistakes that weren't there. Then she walked to the living room and put 1 single gold star next to the question mark under my name on the chart. She said I needed 49 more perfect scores before I'd proven myself worthy of being called their daughter. I thanked her like she'd given me a gift instead of an impossible task. 2 days later, I was in Melissa's office during my free period when her desk phone rang. She answered it and then looked at me and said it was Jing. She put the call on speaker so I could hear. Jing's voice sounded calm and professional as she explained what she'd found in the DNA documents. The lab name on the letterhead wasn't registered with any genetic testing group that regulates these things. The report format didn't match what real labs use. Most important, the test type listed didn't even make sense for what my parents claimed it showed. She said it looked like someone had found a template online and just filled in fake numbers. Her voice got softer when she added that she was sorry, but these documents were definitely made up. I sat there on Melissa's couch feeling this weird mix of relief and horror crash through me at the same time. Relief because I probably wasn't adopted and my parents had lied about the DNA test. Horror because they'd made fake legal documents just to punish me for getting a 93% on one test. What kind of parents do that to their kid? Melissa thanked Jing and hung up the phone. Then she turned to me and explained that this level of mind games, combined with all the physical punishments I'd documented, made the case much stronger for CPS to step in. She said making fake DNA documents to psychologically torture your child was serious abuse that courts would take very seriously. That week, I got a 98% on an English essay. I'd misread 1 question about symbolism, and my answer was good, but not exactly what the teacher wanted. When I brought the essay home, Mom made me sit at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. She told me to write, "I am almost worthy," 500 times while she watched. I started writing, and my hand cramped up after the first 100. Mom sat across from me drinking coffee and reading a magazine like this was normal. My fingers felt like they were on fire by 200. At 300, I could barely hold the pencil. Mom noticed me shaking and said I better not mess up the handwriting or I'd have to start over. The whole thing took 3 hours. When I finally finished, my hand was cramped so badly I couldn't straighten my fingers all the way. Mom picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages, counting the lines. Then she said this was generous compared to what I deserved for continued failure to be perfect. The next week, Melissa called me out of class to tell me that the CPS investigator, a man named Lyle Mercado, had scheduled a home visit. He was coming to our house in 3 days to talk to our family. I was supposed to act normal during the visit, but somehow also communicate the truth if I got a chance. The whole thing felt impossible. My parents were experts at looking perfect for outsiders. They'd fooled teachers and neighbors and doctors for years. How was I supposed to make Lyle see through their act without getting caught and punished later? Melissa squeezed my shoulder and said I just needed to be honest if he asked me questions alone. She said Lyle was experienced and would know what to look for. I found Leo and Kaya that afternoon and pulled them into the library bathroom where no one could hear us. I told them about the CPS visit coming in 3 days. I begged them to be honest with the investigator if they got a chance to talk to him privately. Leo's face went completely white. His hands started shaking and he said he couldn't risk making things worse. What if CPS didn't believe us and then our parents found out we'd told lies? What would they do to us then? I understood his fear, but I was desperate for backup. Kaya's eyes started twitching really fast. She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded slowly and said she'd try to be brave if she got an opportunity to talk to the investigator alone. The night before Lyle's visit, Dad pulled me aside into his office and closed the door. He sat down at his desk and looked at me with that cold, calm expression that was somehow scarier than yelling. He said he wanted to make sure I understood what would happen if I embarrassed the family by telling lies to the investigator. He didn't describe specific punishments. He just said there would be consequences for damaging our family's reputation in the community. His voice was so quiet and controlled that I could barely breathe. He asked if I understood and I nodded because I couldn't make words come out. Then he told me to go to my room. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling. My heart wouldn't stop racing. I didn't sleep at all. Lyle arrived at our house the next afternoon right at 3 o'clock. Mom had baked cookies that morning and the whole house smelled like sugar and vanilla. She opened the door with this huge smile and invited him in like he was a friend stopping by for a visit. Dad came out of his office and shook Lyle's hand and made a joke about typical teenage stress and drama. They led him into the living room and showed him the grade chart on the wall. Mom explained it was just a fun motivation system that we'd all agreed to as a family. She said we were very driven kids who liked tracking our progress. Dad added that we'd always been competitive with each other in a healthy way. I sat on the couch watching them rewrite reality right in front of me. Everything they said was technically true but completely twisted. Yes, we agreed to the chart. We agreed because disagreeing meant punishment. Yes, we were competitive. We were competitive because whoever got the lowest grade became the other's servant. Then Lyle said he'd like to speak with each of us kids individually if that was okay. Mom and Dad's smiles got tight and forced. Mom's voice went a little higher when she said, "Of course that was fine." Dad said we had nothing to hide. Lyle asked to talk to Leo first. They went into the kitchen and my parents hovered near the doorway where they could see Leo but couldn't quite hear the conversation. I watched Leo from the living room. His shoulders were hunched up near his ears. His hands were clenched in his lap. I could tell from his body language that he was giving safe, careful answers that wouldn't get him in trouble later. Lyle comes back into the living room and looks at me. My stomach drops because I know it's my turn now. He asks if we can talk outside on the front porch. I follow him through the kitchen and out the front door. My legs feel shaky and weird. Through the big window, I can see my parents watching us from the living room. They can see everything we do, but the glass is thick enough they can't hear what we're saying. Lyle sits down on the porch steps and tells me to sit too. I sit as far from him as possible because I don't know if this is a trick or if he's actually trying to help. He asks how I'm doing and I just shrug because I don't trust my voice not to crack. Then he says he noticed some things during the house visit that concerned him. He asks if there's anything I want to tell him about what happens at home. I look at the window where Mom and Dad are standing. They're not moving, just watching. My hands start shaking so hard I have to sit on them. I try to think of something safe to say. Something that won't get me in worse trouble but might also help. I tell him in this quiet, shaky voice that I have photos. Photos of documents and other things saved in an email account. I can share it with him if he wants. Lyle's expression changes. He pulls out a business card from his pocket and writes an email address on the back. He tells me to send everything I have to that address. Then he asks me directly if I feel safe at home. I glance back at the window. My parents are still watching. I can see Mom's arms crossed and Dad's face with that cold expression. I say mostly. It's the most honest answer I can give without completely losing it right there on the porch. Lyle writes something in his notebook. He tells me that mostly isn't the same as yes. He says he's going to look into things more carefully. Then we go back inside. After Lyle leaves, the house gets really quiet. That scary kind of quiet where you know something bad is coming but you don't know when or how. My parents don't yell. They don't even look directly at me for a while. Mom goes into the kitchen and starts doing dishes even though the dishes are already clean. Dad sits in his chair reading the newspaper, but I can tell he's not actually reading because the pages don't turn. Kaya and Leo disappear to their rooms fast. I stay in the living room because leaving feels more dangerous than staying. Finally, Dad folds the newspaper and looks at me. He doesn't say anything about what I told Lyle. He just asks if I have homework to do. I say yes and go upstairs. The threat hangs in the air even though nobody said anything specific. I know I need to move fast. I need to send Lyle everything before my parents figure out how much evidence I've been gathering. That night, I can't sleep. I lie in bed watching the clock. At midnight, I'm still awake. At 1, I'm still awake. At 2 in the morning, I finally get up and sneak into the bathroom with my phone. I lock the door and sit on the floor. I turn my phone brightness all the way down so no light shows under the door. Then I open my secret email account and start a new message to the address Lyle gave me. I attach all the photos of the DNA documents. Then the pictures I took of the grade chart with all the red X's and the question mark under my name. I type out the whole timeline of punishments I've been keeping. The sign holding incident. Kaya's head shaving. Leo's homeless shelter night. The basement isolation. Everything. I add a list of people who might have seen things. The neighbor who saw me holding the sign. The hospital social worker who was there when they pumped Kaya's stomach. My hands are shaking so bad I keep making typos and having to fix them. Finally, I hit send. Then I delete the sent message from my sent folder. I clear my browser history. I clear my cache. I make sure there's no trace of what I just did. I sneak back to my room and get into bed. My heart is racing. So fast I think I might throw up. But I did it. I sent everything. The next day at the school, I go straight to Melissa's office during my free period. She's waiting for me. She closes the door and tells me that Lyle got my email. He's moving forward with a more serious investigation now. She says the evidence I sent is really helpful. Then she tells me that Jing looked at the DNA documents and is willing to give expert testimony about how they're fake. She says this could be really important for proving the psychological abuse. I feel this weird mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone believes me. Fear about what happens when my parents find out. I ask Melissa if there's a way to prove Kaya and I are actually siblings. Like a real DNA test that would show the documents are fake. Melissa thinks about this. She says it's possible, but we'd need Kaya's permission. And we'd have to be really careful to keep her safe from our parents finding out and punishing her. She says she can look into labs that do sibling tests. I tell her I think Kaya would do it if it helps. Melissa says she'll make some calls. During lunch, I find Kaya in the library. She's sitting alone at a table in the back corner studying for something. I sit down next to her and check to make sure nobody else is close enough to hear. Then I explain as quietly as I can. I tell her we could do a real sibling DNA test to prove Mom and Dad lied about me not being their daughter. Her eye starts twitching really fast. She stares at her textbook for a long time without saying anything. I'm scared she's going to say no. I'm scared she's too afraid to help. But then she nods slowly. She says she'll do it if it helps get us all out of this situation. She says she's tired of being scared all the time. I feel this huge wave of love for my little sister. She's braver than I ever gave her credit for. I squeeze her hand under the table and tell her thank you. Melissa helps me set everything up. She talks to the school nurse and explains the situation. The nurse agrees to help. She says Kaya can come to her office and give a cheek swab sample. Everything will be documented properly, so it can be used as evidence. Melissa got the name of a lab from Jing. It's a real legitimate lab that does kinship testing. They're going to rush the results because this is a child protection case. The next day, Kaya goes to the nurse's office during her study hall. I wait in the bathroom nearby, feeling sick with worry. What if my parents somehow find out? What if this makes everything worse? But 20 minutes later, Kaya comes out. She gives me a tiny nod. It's done. The nurse sent the sample to the lab. Now we just have to wait for results. At home, I go back to being the terrified, perfect daughter. I get 100% on a chemistry quiz. I get 100% on a history test. I get 100% on my calculus homework. Every single assignment that week is perfect. Mom gives me back 3 gold stars. She says I'm making progress toward proving myself worthy. Dad watches me do my homework every night and doesn't find a single mistake. They seem satisfied. They think their DNA revelation scared me back into perfection. They don't know about the evidence I sent to Lyle. They don't know about Kaya's cheek swab sitting in a lab somewhere. They don't know I'm counting down the days until the test results come back. I play my part perfectly. Scared, compliant, desperate to please them. Inside, I'm just waiting. One evening, Leo catches me alone in the hallway between our rooms. He looks around to make sure Mom and Dad aren't nearby. Then he whispers that he's been documenting things too. He's been keeping a list on his phone of every time they mention the DNA test. Every time they threaten punishment. Every time they make us compete against each other. He's too scared to talk to CPS directly. He's still terrified of what they might do if they find out. But he wants to help however he can from the background. He shows me his phone screen. The list is long. Really long. Dates and times and exact quotes. I feel grateful and sad at the same time. Grateful that he's trying to help. Sad that he's still so scared he can barely function. I tell him to keep the list somewhere safe. Somewhere Mom and Dad won't find it if they check his phone. He nods and disappears back into his room. I go to mine and add this to my own documentation. Leo is helping. Kaya is helping. We're all working together even though we're all terrified. Maybe that's enough. 2 weeks go by slowly. Every day I check my phone hoping for news about the DNA test results. I keep getting perfect scores on everything because I'm too scared to mess up while we're waiting. Mom gives me more gold stars and seems pleased that the DNA revelation motivated me. She doesn't know I'm counting down the days until the results prove she lied. On Tuesday during my free period, my phone buzzes with a call from Melissa. I duck into the nearest bathroom and answer in a whisper. She tells me the results came back and they show a 99% probability that Kaya and I are full biological siblings, which means the documents my parents showed me were definitely fake. I sit down in a bathroom stall because my legs stop working. My hands shake so hard I almost drop the phone. Part of me feels this huge relief because I'm not adopted and I'm not broken and I really am their daughter. But another part feels this crushing grief because they lied about something so big just to punish me for one bad grade. Melissa asks if I'm okay and I say yes, but I'm crying now and can't really talk. She tells me to take my time and that she'll be in her office when I'm ready. I sit there for 10 minutes just breathing and trying to process what this means. My parents made up fake DNA documents. They probably spent hours creating them just to have a weapon ready for when one of us failed. That's not normal parent behavior. That's not even close to normal. When I finally leave the bathroom, I go straight to Melissa's office. She closes the door and lets me sit quietly for a minute before explaining the next steps. Jing is preparing a detailed report about how the DNA documents are fake and how the real sibling test proves their claims were false. The report will include information about the psychological harm of using fake genetic testing as a punishment tool. Melissa says this report will be really important for the CPS case because it shows my parents deliberately fabricated evidence to manipulate me. I ask how long the report will take, and she says Jing is rushing it because of the child protection circumstances. Maybe a few days at most. Then Lyle will have everything he needs to move forward with more serious intervention. I feel this weird mix of hope and terror. Hope that this might actually work. Terror about what happens if it doesn't. 3 days later, Melissa calls me to her office again and tells me Lyle wants to schedule another meeting. But this time, it's at the school with Principal Dustin McDaniel present. She explains that having the principal there signals things are getting more serious and official. My parents are being told they need to attend a conference about my academic concerns. I feel my stomach drop because that's obviously a cover story, and my parents are going to know something is wrong. Melissa says the meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday, which gives us 5 days to prepare. She asks if I think my parents will suspect anything, and I say yes, definitely. Mom's voice on the phone when the school called sounded tight and angry. She asked me 3 times if I'd been talking to anyone about family business, and I said no, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, my parents sit me down at the kitchen table. The grade chart looms on the wall behind them with my question mark still visible under my name. Dad looks at me with that cold expression he gets when he's really mad. He tells me in his iciest voice that I better not have been spreading lies about our family, because there will be severe consequences if I've damaged their reputation. Mom adds that the DNA test proves I'm not really theirs anyway, so they could always just send me away if I become too much trouble. She says it calmly like she's discussing the weather, but the threat is clear. I force myself to look scared and confused and promise I haven't said anything bad about them. Dad stares at me for a long time like he's trying to see inside my head. Then he tells me the school meeting better go well or I'll regret it. They don't specify what that means, but I don't need them to. I've seen what they do to kids who disappoint them. I barely sleep that night. Every time I close my eyes, I imagine the meeting going wrong. My parents convincing everyone I'm lying. Them taking me home and locking me in the basement forever. Them actually sending me away somewhere. But I also know this might be my only chance to get free from their control. If I don't go through with it now, I'll be stuck with them until I turn 18. And by then, who knows what kind of damage they'll have done. So the next morning before school, I pack a small bag with essentials. A change of clothes, my toothbrush, the notebook where I've been documenting everything, some money I've been saving from birthdays. I hide the bag in my locker at the school just in case I need to leave quickly. Just in case the meeting goes badly and I can't go home. Melissa said CPS might have emergency placement options if things escalate. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I need to be ready. The days before the meeting drag by. I get perfect scores on everything and act like the obedient, terrified daughter they expect. At home, I'm quiet and compliant. At the school, I'm secretly preparing with Melissa. She helps me practice what to say if my parents try to make me lie. She reminds me that Lyle and Principal McDaniel will be there to keep me safe. She promises that no matter what happens in that room, I did the right thing by reporting. But I still feel sick with fear every time I think about Tuesday. Finally, Tuesday arrives. The meeting is scheduled for right after school in Principal McDaniel's conference room. I sit through my classes barely paying attention. My hands shake when I take notes. During lunch, I can't eat anything. Kaya finds me in the hallway between classes and squeezes my hand. She whispers good luck, and I realize Melissa must have told her what's happening today. When the final bell rings, I walk slowly toward the main office. My legs feel heavy like I'm walking through mud. The conference room door is closed, but I can hear voices inside. I take a deep breath and knock. Principal McDaniel opens the door. The room has a big table with chairs around it. Lyle sits on one side with Melissa next to him. My parents sit on the other side and they look calm and professional, but I can feel their rage from across the room. It's like this invisible pressure in the air. Mom gives me a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Dad nods toward an empty chair next to them. I sit down and Principal McDaniel closes the door. He explains that we're here to discuss some concerns that have come up, and that everyone should have a chance to speak. There's a phone in the middle of the table, and he says Jing is available to join the call if needed. My parents' smiles get tighter when they hear that. Lyle starts by explaining that some information has come to light about the home environment. He says CPS needs to address some serious allegations about the treatment of the children in the household. My parents immediately go into defensive mode. Mom says everything they do is for our success, and that they've sacrificed so much to give us opportunities. Dad adds that I'm a dramatic teenager who exaggerates normal parenting because I don't like being held to high standards. He says all parents push their kids to do well in the school and that we're just more dedicated than most families. Mom nods and says they're disappointed I would make up stories just because I got in trouble for a bad grade. They sound so reasonable and concerned. If I didn't know better, I would believe them. Then Lyle opens a folder and starts presenting evidence. He shows the photos of the grade chart with all the red X's and the question mark under my name. He shows the timeline I created documenting punishments with specific dates and descriptions. He mentions witness statements from neighbors who saw the sign-holding incident. He brings up the hospital social worker who documented Kaya after her suicide attempt. With each piece of evidence, my parents' masks start to crack a little. Mom's smile becomes forced. Dad's jaw gets tight. They try to interrupt, but Lyle keeps talking in this calm, steady voice. He lists the specific punishments. The head shaving, the basement isolation, the homeless shelter abandonment. When he's done, there's this heavy silence in the room. Dad recovers first and tries to use the DNA test as his defense. He says I'm a troubled non-biological child who's been making up stories to get attention. He claims the DNA test proves I'm not really theirs, and that explains why I'm behaving this way. Mom nods and adds that they've tried to help me despite learning I wasn't their biological daughter, but I've been ungrateful and manipulative. For a second, I feel that old fear rising up. What if people believe them? But then Lyle calmly pulls out another document. He presents Jing's expert report about the fraudulent DNA documents. He shows the real sibling test results proving Kaya and I are full biological siblings. He explains that this means the documents my parents showed me were fabricated. I watch my parents' faces as they realize their fake documents have been exposed. Mom's mouth opens slightly. Dad's face goes red. It's scary watching them lose control, but also satisfying in this weird way. They lied, and now everyone knows it. Principal McDaniel picks up the phone and dials Jing's number. She answers, and he puts her on speaker. Jing introduces herself and explains her credentials as a genetic counselor. Then she goes through the DNA documents in clear professional language. She points out how the lab name isn't registered with any regulatory body. She explains how the report format doesn't match industry standards. She describes how the test type listed doesn't even make sense for what my parents claimed it showed. She says it looks like someone downloaded a template online and filled in fake information. Then she talks about the psychological harm of using fake genetic testing as a punishment tool. She explains how telling a child they're not really part of the family as a response to academic imperfection constitutes severe emotional abuse. My parents try to interrupt several times, but Principal McDaniel firmly tells them to let Jing finish. When she's done explaining everything, there's another heavy silence. My parents sit there looking angry and exposed, and I realize for the first time that they might not win this. Mom's face crumples and tears start running down her cheeks. She reaches across the table toward me with shaking hands. She says, "We only wanted you to succeed. We were trying to motivate you. We love you so much." But her voice sounds fake even to me, and I can see Lyle watching her with this completely neutral expression. He opens his folder and starts reading from his notes in that same calm, steady voice. He mentions the sign-holding incident where the narrator stood in July heat for 4 hours. He describes the head-shaving punishment inflicted on Kaya in 5th grade. He talks about the basement isolation with no food for 3 days. He brings up Leo being abandoned at a homeless shelter overnight at age 12. With each item, Mom's crying gets louder but also more desperate, like she knows it's not working. Dad sits perfectly still beside her with his jaw clenched so tight I can see the muscles jumping. Lyle finishes his list and looks at my parents. "Even her tears can't make those things sound like normal parenting," he says quietly. The room goes silent except for Mom's fake sobbing. Then Lyle pulls out another document and my stomach drops because I know something big is coming. Based on the evidence we've reviewed and the expert testimony provided, he says CPS is implementing an immediate safety plan. He explains that all 3 children will be placed in temporary foster care, while my parents undergo psychological evaluation and complete mandated parenting services. Dad explodes out of his chair so fast it crashes backward onto the floor. His face goes bright red and he starts yelling about how this is illegal and they're violating his rights and he's calling his lawyer right now. Mom stops crying instantly and joins in, her voice sharp and cold, saying they can't just take their children away without proper cause. Lyle doesn't even flinch. He stays seated and keeps his voice level. Child safety takes priority over parental preferences, he says. The evidence of emotional and psychological abuse is substantial and documented. The fabricated DNA documents alone constitute severe manipulation. Principal McDaniel nods and adds that the school fully supports this decision given what they've witnessed. I start shaking so hard my teeth actually chatter. My whole body feels like it's vibrating and I can't make it stop. Lyle looks at me and his expression softens just slightly. "You'll be going home with a temporary foster parent today," he tells me. "We'll arrange to collect your belongings safely." I try to process what he's saying, but my brain feels fuzzy. Melissa reaches over and puts her hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," she says quietly. "You protected yourself and your siblings. This is the beginning of getting better." I want to believe her, but I'm also terrified of what happens next. Dad is still yelling about lawyers and rights and how we're ungrateful. Mom has switched to this icy quiet rage that's somehow scarier than the yelling. Principal McDaniel picks up his phone and makes a call. 20 minutes later, there's a knock on the conference room door. A staff member brings in Kaya and Leo. They both look confused and scared. Kaya's eye is twitching like crazy, and Leo has his hands shoved deep in his pockets, probably to keep from pulling his hair. Lyle gestures for them to sit down. He explains in simple, clear language that they're going to safe placements where they'll be protected and cared for. I watch their faces change as they understand what's happening. First confusion, then fear, then this cautious relief starts creeping in around the edges. Leo's eyes fill with tears and they start running down his face silently. Kaya's eye twitches faster, but she's also nodding slowly. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Lyle asks them both. They nod again. Leo wipes his face with his sleeve. Kaya reaches under the table and squeezes my hand so hard it hurts. Mom stands up suddenly and her chair scrapes loud against the floor. We demand to speak with our children privately, she says in that cold, controlled voice. Lyle shakes his head. All contact will be supervised going forward, he tells her. That's part of the safety plan. Dad's mask finally shatters completely. He starts screaming about how ungrateful we are and how we've destroyed this family and ruined everything they built. He says we'll regret this for the rest of our lives. He calls us weak and pathetic and says we'll never survive in the real world without them. Mom joins in listing all the sacrifices they made and how we're throwing it back in their faces. Principal McDaniel stands up and firmly tells them they need to leave the building now or he'll call security. The yelling proves everything we've been saying about you, Lyle adds quietly. My parents finally storm out, but I can hear Dad shouting in the hallway about lawyers and lawsuits. The conference room feels weirdly quiet after they leave. Lyle makes some phone calls while we sit there in shock. Melissa brings us water and tissues. Leo is still crying silently. Kaya won't let go of my hand. An hour later, a woman arrives and introduces herself as Fernanda Brooks. She has kind eyes and speaks softly. She explains she has experience with kids from high-pressure academic situations. I'm going home with her today. A different person comes for Kaya and someone else for Leo. We hug each other tight before we separate. Kaya whispers, "Be safe," and Leo just squeezes me hard. Fernanda drives me to her house in a quiet neighborhood. The house is small and neat. Inside, there are no grade charts on the walls. No red X's or gold stars. Just normal family photos and some plants. The first rule here is that you're allowed to make mistakes without punishment, Fernanda tells me as she shows me my room. I nod, but I don't really believe her yet. That night, I'm sitting at the desk in my new room working on homework that's due tomorrow. I finish a math worksheet and check my answers 3 times like I always do. When I calculate my score, I get a 96%. My chest immediately tightens and I can't breathe right. My hands start shaking and the paper blurs. I'm going to be punished. I know I'm going to be punished. My brain is screaming about what's coming even though I'm not at home anymore. Fernanda must hear something because she appears in the doorway. She sees me hyperventilating over my homework and sits down beside me. She doesn't touch me, but she talks in this calm, steady voice. Breathe in for 4 counts, she says. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She does it with me until my breathing slows down. What happened? She asks gently. I show her the worksheet with my 96% score. She looks at it and then at me. Grades are just information about learning, she says. They're not measures of your worth as a person. A 96% means you understood most of the material really well, and there's a small part you can review if you want to. That's all it means. I want to believe her, but 17 years of programming doesn't disappear in one night. Over the next few weeks, I start seeing a therapist named Wesley Klein. His office is comfortable with soft chairs, and he never makes me feel rushed. He specializes in abuse recovery and perfectionism trauma. During our sessions, he helps me understand that what my parents did wasn't normal parenting. He explains that their fear of poverty doesn't justify the harm they caused. He teaches me techniques for managing my panic when I make mistakes. It's slow work, and sometimes I still feel that old terror rising up. But gradually, I start to see that grades really are just information, and not weapons. Kaya gets placed with a different foster family who has experience with suicide attempt recovery. I talk to her on supervised phone calls, and she tells me she's getting treatment for her anxiety tic. She's seeing a therapist too, and learning that her worth isn't tied to perfect performance. Her eye still twitches, but not as constantly as before. Leo goes to a specialized placement that can help with his hair pulling and sleep issues. He's working with someone who understands trauma responses. When we talk, he sounds tired, but also cautiously hopeful. We're all beginning to stabilize in environments where mistakes don't equal catastrophe. The school implements accommodations for all 3 of us. We get extra time on tests if we need it. We can retake assignments to improve our understanding. We have regular check-ins with counselors who actually care about our well-being, not just our grades. For the first time in my life, I turn in an essay that I know isn't perfect. I can see the weak spots in my argument, and I know my conclusion could be stronger. When I get an 89% back, I feel my chest tighten and my hands start to shake. But then I remember what Fernanda said and what Wesley taught me. I breathe through it. I don't have a complete breakdown. I look at the teacher's comments about what I did well and what I could improve. And then I move on to my next assignment without spending hours punishing myself for not being perfect. A few weeks later, Lyle calls to update me on my parents' case and tells me they're required to attend parenting classes and go through psychological testing before anyone can even think about contact with us. He says they're fighting the whole process and telling anyone who'll listen that we're lying and ungrateful. Part of me feels sick about breaking up the family because that's what 17 years of their programming does to you. But Wesley helps me work through it in our sessions by asking me to list what a healthy family actually looks like and then compare it to what we had. When I write down all the punishments and threats and manipulation, it becomes really clear that they broke the family long before I ever reported anything. The guilt still shows up sometimes, but I'm learning to recognize it as their voice in my head, not my actual feelings. 3 months into placement, I go to the county records office with Fernanda to request my birth certificate because I need that official proof. The clerk hands me the document through the window, and I stand there in the lobby staring at my parents' names listed as mother and father with the state seal stamped across the bottom. It confirms exactly what the sibling test already showed, but holding this physical paper feels different, like I'm taking back a piece of myself they tried to steal with their fake DNA folder. Fernanda doesn't say anything, just stands next to me while I fold the certificate carefully and put it in my backpack. I'm learning to accept being imperfect in small ways that still feel huge to me. I let myself sleep an extra hour on Saturday instead of studying and don't have a panic attack about it. I turn in homework that's good enough instead of perfect, and remind myself that 87% just means I understood most of the material. I'm starting to imagine a future where my worth isn't measured by gold stars on a chart or red X's circled in marker. Kaya is back in regular counseling, and her eye tick is getting better. Not gone, but not constant anymore. Leo has a treatment plan for his anxiety and hair pulling, and he's actually growing his hair back in patches. Our parents are still under CPS monitoring with supervised contact only, which means they can't hurt us anymore even if they're not actually getting better themselves. The path forward isn't perfect or easy, but for the first time we're all safe enough to actually heal. I'm building a life where a 93% is just a grade, not a weapon someone uses to destroy me. All right, your turn. What would you have done in this situation? Seriously, tell me in the comments. And if you liked this, subscribe, because we do this every video. Let's hear it.